My name is Roger Schrader. I'd like to welcome you all to this Sundays at CTU. As was mentioned earlier by CTU President Barbara Reed, this Sundays at CTU is being sponsored by the Committee of World Mission here at CTU, which I am chairing, and other members have prepared the prayer service that we've heard and prayed together today, including Dr. Annie McGowan. I'd like to thank you, Annie, again for taking the lead in preparing this beautiful prayer service for us. And also that Kathy Solano could join us from Australia, so it's very good. The Spirit spreads around the world, and we could be drawn together because we're doing this via Zoom. Our speaker today, Dr. Steve Bevans, is also a member of this committee. Steve was on the faculty here at CTU for 29 years. He retired in 2015. And Steve continues to serve on this committee, even though he's retired. So his commitment to CTU continues. And we're very glad to have Steve with us today. As Barbara Reed mentioned, Steve is a member of the Society of the Divine Word. Early in his life, in his missionary life, he worked in the Philippines, taught in the Philippines for 9 years. Then he returned and he did his studies, his doctoral studies, and then came to teach here at CTU. Steve has authored or edited about 20 books, including his world-famous Models of Contextual Theology and many other things that many of us are already aware of. And he continues in these endeavors. I know he's continuing to write and do that as well. I've been privileged to work with Steve as a co-author on some works, and also we live together in the same local community as well. And it's really a personal, a professional privilege for me to introduce Steve with us today as my colleague, my confrere, and a very good friend. So welcome, Steve. We look forward to hearing the words that you are sharing with us today.
Well, thank you very, very much, Roger. And good afternoon or good morning or good evening, whatever it might be, where everyone is. It's really a privilege and a deep joy to be with you, for me, this afternoon. I'm going to now share my screen and I'll begin my presentation. So as Barbara Reed said, President Barbara Reed said, the topic of today's reflection is Pope Francis's theology of attraction. And I want to begin my reflections with a quotation from Pope Francis. And it goes like this: Christians have the duty to proclaim the gospel without excluding anyone. Instead of seeming to impose new obligations, they should appear as people who wish to share their joy, who point to a horizon of beauty, and who invite others to a delicious banquet. It is not by proselytizing that the church grows, but by attraction. These words are from Pope Francis's wonderful apostolic exhortation of 2017, Evangelii Gaudium, paragraph 17. And I think they express the essence of Francis's understanding of the church's mission, which is, I think, based on what I would call a theology of attraction. Now, the quotation at the end, by attraction, is actually taken from Francis's predecessor, Benedict XVI. He said these words in his homily at the opening of the 2007 Latin American and Caribbean Bishops' Conference meeting in Aparecida, Brazil, where Jorge Mario Bergoglio was surely present and heard these words in person. They are not words that are original with Francis, but in any case, the phrase abounds in Pope Francis's writings and talks. To just give a few examples, he used the term in his June 2018 visit to the World Council of Churches headquarters in Geneva. You see the picture here with the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. He used the words in an interview with an Argentine newspaper, a time when he was talking to Italian religious superiors, a time when he was talking to educators. The words appear in several daily mass homilies. He said them on the plane returning from Bangladesh. In his beautiful apostolic exhortation on spirituality, Gaudete et Exultate, to vocation directors in June of 2019, in his opening homily of the Pan-Amazonian Synod, also in 2019. Interesting and maybe a little bit embarrassing for me at this moment, he didn't use the term in his new encyclical Fratelli Tutti. But if you read the document, the whole document is written, I believe, in a very attractive spirit, and it's addressed not just to Catholics, but to all peoples of the earth, the same as he did with Laudato Si. So he is certainly warm and open in these documents, even though in Fratelli Tutti he doesn't use the words. But I think witnessing and proclaiming the gospel in a way that attracts seems quite central to the way that Francis would have the church go forth, as he writes, as a community of missionary disciples. So this afternoon, I'd like to develop a bit Pope Francis's theology of attraction in three reflections. Francis speaks of the need for a message that attracts. He speaks of the need for a community that attracts. And he speaks of a need for a teaching that attracts. So let's look first at the need for a message that attracts, which is basically his wonderful message of a God of mercy and tenderness. For Francis, the church really does have good news. It is the bearer of good news, news of joy, news of beauty, and an invitation to a delicious banquet, as we saw in the beginning of our talk. The church has a message that attracts, and foundational to this is the image of God as a God of mercy and tenderness. The fire of God, he said in his opening homily for the Pan-Amazonian Synod, is warmth that attracts and gathers into unity, a fire of love that illumines, warms, and gives life. At the beginning of Evangelii Gaudium, he writes that God never tires of forgiving us. We are the ones who tire in seeking God's mercy. At one place is one of my favorite places in the document. He quotes Thomas Aquinas, and Aquinas writes this: "It is proper to God to have mercy, through which God's omnipotence is manifested to the greatest degree." And then in the document that opened the Jubilee of Mercy in 2016, Francis quotes Augustine, another one of these wonderful quotations. "It is easier for God to hold back anger than to hold back mercy. And he says, mercy is not an abstract idea, but a concrete reality through which God reveals God's love as that of a father or mother, full of tenderness and compassion, indulgence and mercy. Just the other day, I ran across this quotation from Pope Francis talking to the bishops of Mexico in 2016. He's speaking at the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and he says, La Virgen Morenita teaches us that the only power capable of conquering the hearts of men and women is the tenderness of God. That which delights and attracts, that which humbles and overcomes, that which opens and unleashes is not the power of instruments or the force of law, but rather the omnipotent weakness of divine love. Just a beautiful quotation and a beautiful idea. Jesus, who is the face of God's mercy, Francis says, always offers women and men a new start with a tenderness which never disappoints, but is always capable of restoring our joy. And if you've read a biography of Francis or read a lot about him, he understands this very, very personally. At one point in his life, when he was going to confession, he had a deep experience of God's mercy. And in his early interview with fellow Jesuit Antonio Spadaro, he refers to his fondness for the artist Caravaggio's painting, The Call of St. Matthew. And he talks about this. He says, here, this is me, a sinner on whom the Lord has turned his gaze. And as Francis writes in his document, Vultus Misericordiae, when we look at Jesus and meet his gaze, we experience the love of the Holy Trinity. This is the love that has been made visible and tangible in Jesus's life and ministry. Everything Jesus does in terms of healing the sick, of identifying with the marginalized, liberating women and men from demonic forces, Francis says, all are meant to teach mercy. Everything in him speaks of mercy. Nothing in him is devoid of compassion. In one of his daily homilies on September 13th, 2016, Francis is commenting in the homily on the raising of the son of the widow at Nain. And I think it's a great example of his understanding Jesus as the face of mercy. He says that Jesus, when he saw this woman and her sorrow, was seized with compassion. And so he involved himself with that woman's problem. He touched the coffin, but he also touched the woman as well, a caress, because Jesus was moved. And then he performed the miracle. I was reading some things of Pope Francis yesterday evening, and I came across a homily, another homily that he gave a couple of months earlier. And I think it makes sense to talk about it here. Francis says, the good shepherd does not wear gloves. It's a beautiful Visio Divina right there. You see Jesus's hand, this ungloved hand, caressing the grieving woman. This is a picture of God. This is who God is. Now, certainly none of what Francis says is brand new, but I think he articulates it with a freshness that, at least for me, throws new light on the gospel message. So as he says in the passage with which I began, Christians share the gospel not by trying to impose new obligations, but simply sharing their joy, inviting people to a delicious banquet. So the message must be one that attracts. The message must be one that attracts, but we have to have also a community that attracts, to be a church with open doors. Francis says that one of the lessons of the parable of what he calls the ruthless servant, the unjust servant in Matthew chapter 18, is that mercy is not only an action of the Father, it becomes a criterion for ascertaining who God's children are. He says, the Son of God becoming flesh summoned us to the revolution of tenderness, summoned us to the revolution of tenderness. And so for Francis, the mercy and tenderness of God needs to take a concrete form in a church, in a community that is itself merciful and tender. So the gospel is preached most effectively by a community that embodies that gospel message, that evangelizes by attraction. As Pope Paul VI said in 1975, and Francis repeats it in Evangelii Gaudium, people prefer to listen to witnesses. The church, Francis says, should be an oasis of mercy, a place of mercy freely given, where all can feel welcomed, loved, forgiven, and encouraged. The house of the Father, the house of the Father of the prodigal son. And Francis insists that the doors of the sacraments should not be closed for simply any reason. The picture here is Francis baptizing a baby whose parents had not been married in the church, and yet he insisted that the doors of baptism should be open. He speaks about the Eucharist as not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak. And he went on to develop this in very, very controversially for some people in his document Amoris Laetitia, where he said that even people in what he called irregular relationships, those who are not married in the church or living together, or who are married and divorced, should be somehow encouraged to participate as much as possible as they can in the life of the church. He talks about how the confessional should not be a torture chamber. And when people criticize him in Amoris Laetitia, he says, I know that some bishops think that I'm, being too lax, but he says, I sincerely believe that Jesus wants a church attentive to the goodness which the Holy Spirit sows in the midst of human weakness. And he says, I think that being too strict is the worst way of watering down the gospel. Not being too lax, but being too strict is the worst way of watering down the gospel. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to my friend and colleague, Steve Millies, who was teaching a class at Loyola University in this past semester. And we were talking about Francis and the theology of attraction. And Steve says, one of my students said in class, the church should not be a church of no, but a church of yes. I think that's such a beautiful phrase. It's such a powerful phrase. And it's like Paul says in 2 Corinthians, Jesus is never no, but always yes. And so must we, people who are members of his body, be always yes and not no. So mission has to be first for Francis, and doctrine follows. And here we get into the whole question of the coming Curial reform, which we hope will soon be published. It's been ready for a while, but they're kind of dotting the T's and dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and it's soon to be published. Just for those of you who may not know about the Curia, it was established by Pope Sixtus V in the 16th century to help the Pope govern the church. But unfortunately, over the years, it got more and more centralized in Rome and saw itself actually more important than even the local bishops. They were subservient to the Curia. But the new document is going to reverse all of that. The new document says that the Curia is not only to help the Pope govern the church, but also the bishops govern their local churches, because both are successors to the apostles, and both have a responsibility together as a college for governing the church. The title of the new document on curial reform is important. It's called Predicate Evangelium, Preach the Gospel. In an article in April 2019, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, Cardinal Gracious or Cardinal Gracias from New Delhi in India, says that the point of this document is that evangelization is the number one goal ahead of everything else. And in his recent book on Pope Francis, the scholar Massimo Fagioli says that the whole curial reform is part of Francis's efforts to create a truly missionary church. What this document does is it merges two groups. The Pontifical Council for the New Evangelization, which was developed by Benedict XVI, is now merged together with the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, and it's given a new name. It's going to be called the Dicastery for Evangelization. And the key thing here in the list of all of them are going to be called dicasteries, a strange name, it seems to me, but they're all kind of councils or something like that. And they're all going to be called this. There's no congregations and councils and secretariats anymore. They're all dicasteries. But in the list, it's mentioned first before the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, which means that mission, evangelization, ministry is actually something that is more important than orthodoxy as such. So I know that this might not sound like much, but it really could be revolutionary, because the whole point is to decentralize the church, to make it more inviting, to make it more participating in evangelization. It really promotes the local churches and local cultures and local customs, local bishops' conferences. It points to the kind of cardinals that Francis has appointed. The picture here is Francis investing Cardinal Wilton Gregory of Washington, but there are cardinals all over the world in the places where there ordinarily weren't cardinals, but Francis is emphasizing the universality of the church and the importance of the poorest dioceses in the church. The Curial reform emphasizes the role of the laity, saying that even a lay person, a woman, could actually head one of these dicasteries in the new Curial reform and put everything at the service of evangelization. This would be great if it works. We'll see. The church is big and slow to change, but at least it looks like some of the mechanism is being put in place, and it could make certainly a more attractive church. Now, an attractive church should also be a church of equality, where everyone is respected and heard, where there's no clericalism. As Francis says, quoting John Paul II in Evangelii Gaudium, it must be remembered that when we speak of sacramental power, we are in the realm of function, not that of dignity or holiness. He goes on to say the configuration of the priest to Christ the head does not imply an exaltation which would set him above others, because our great dignity derives from baptism, which is accessible to all. Francis is always talking about the sense of the faithful, that everyone is equal in a community of missionary disciples. And so we must avoid ordaining little monsters that lord it over the church simply because they're ordained. The other day, I came across a wonderful quotation from Francis to the bishops of Brazil early in his pontificate. Unless we train ministers capable of warming people's hearts, so attracting people, of dialoguing with their hopes and disappointments, of mending their brokenness, what hope can we have for our present and future journey? And finally, Francis is also insistent that the church must be, as he says over and over again, poor and for the poor. A church that attracts has to show the world where its priorities are, and that all are welcome within it. The church needs to be evangelized by the poor. Francis insists that the poor are not just objects of our concern, but rather our subjects, our actors, and we need to listen to them. The church needs to be a place where the poor feel at home. So a church of inclusion, a church of equality, a church that offers an ungloved caress of love, a church that journeys together in synodality, a church that welcomes the poor and is led by the poor's experience. This is the church that shows forth the joy of the gospel, its beauty, and its attractiveness. Third and finally, Francis talks about the need for a teaching church, a teaching that attracts. And so the development of a theology sensitive to context. The church is missionary by its very nature. It is a church that puts evangelization first. And because of that, theologians have to work to advance dialogue with the world of cultures and sciences so that the gospel can be proclaimed and taught in an attractive way. This is essential to the church's mission. And to neglect this attention to science and to the world's culture is to betray evangelization, is to betray mission. Francis says we would not do justice to the logic of the incarnation if we thought of Christianity as monocultural and monotonous. The church constantly needs to seek ways of expressing unchanging truths in a language which brings out their abiding newness. He says, sometimes you can listen to a homily and it's perfectly orthodox, but, everybody says, so what? It doesn't, this just goes right over my head. He says, this lack of understanding is the greatest danger in evangelization. And he says, we need to be more bold in helping people understand the gospel message. We cannot be overly fearful that we're going to be unorthodox. But he says, and I love this phrase from his homily at the opening of the Pan-Amazonian Synod, we need to proceed in daring prudence. So it's this concern for attractive teaching that motivates Francis all the time in his daily homilies, his weekly Wednesday discourses, his major writings, as you see here in the pictures. Laudato Si addresses one of the major challenges of our day. Amoris Laetitia addresses important concerns of pastoral practice. Christus Vivit, that he wrote after the Synod on Youth, attempts to connect the church with youth. And Fratelli Tutti, which of course is not a good title, it should be Fratelli e Sorelle Tutti Tutte, but in any case, it's attractively written. Of course, there are aspects of Francis's teaching that are not attractive to many. His insistence on limiting presbyteral ordination to men goes against those of us who are sensitive to gender issues, or his hesitation so far to ordain women to the diaconate. Laudato Si mentions very few women, I think only 2. And as Dan Horan points out in his wonderful commentary on Fratelli Tutti, he mentions no women when he gives examples in Fratelli Tutti. Francis is adamantly opposed to same-sex unions, although, he's somewhat ambiguous on this in some ways. On the other hand, many find Francis too liberal on many issues, and there's a real pushback with a lot of people, as we know, on some of his policies. But I think Francis does try to be faithful to tradition while still striving to teach attractively. In conclusion, I think we can say, there might be many other ways that we can speak about Pope Francis's understanding of the church and of its mission. So his ecological commitment is very strong. His concern for the poor, for world Christianity, or for missionary formation. But what I've tried to present here is maybe something more fundamental. His fundamental conviction that the church grows and thrives, not by pressure or by proselytism, or even by increased zeal of missionaries, get out there and really try harder, but rather it grows by being a clear sign of God's tenderness in the world. And so it grows by attraction. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think that we're now ready for some some questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that lecture. I was afraid that we wouldn't have many questions, but they have queued up in the chat. So without further ado, I am Colleen Kennedy. I'm Vice President for Institutional Advancement here at CTU. And I'd like to add my welcome to each of you here with us today for this lecture in liturgy experience. Because of the sheer number of participants here, it could be Steve Bevans's Theology of Attraction, apparently. We have almost 350. We are going to take the questions through the chat. So I will begin at the top of the queue with a question from Pat Murphy. Steve, can the church truly be inclusive if it does not recognize that Christ can and does call women to ordained ministry? So an easy question to begin.
Well, it's an easy question, but a dangerous question. And I would say, frankly, no. I don't think so. So there you are. No, I don't. I mean, that will certainly never make me a bishop, but I think that's the truth.
Okay, thank you. From Kathy Schmidtkins, we know the resistance to Pope Francis here in the US. Can you evaluate how the rest of the church views him?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I was on a wonderful program at the Overseas Ministry Study Center in Princeton, New Jersey. And it was on Pope Francis and mission. And there was a very interesting man who was part of the panel, as Mike, I want to say, it's not Mike Myers, but I can't remember his last name. It just escapes me. But anyway, he runs a kind of a website that tracks some of the American pushback on Francis. And he was talking about how, particularly like EWTN, is starting a campaign in Africa, like against Pope Francis. And there are other places where this is the case. So he is rather concerned that some of this is growing. I do think that this is still a minority. But oh, there it is. Steve Millie's just told me it's Mike Lewis. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that very much. It was just on the tip of my tongue and I couldn't remember. But I know he's a friend of Steve Millie's as well. So so it is something that is unfortunately growing around the church. But I do think it's a minority, and I think again truth will eventually have its day.
Very good. Thank you, Steve. Our next question comes from Catherine Vinci. How would such an approach of attraction change or modify the liturgy?
Thank you, Catherine. I saw your name when you came into the chat. It's been years since we've seen one another, but I remember you very fondly from our time in Keystone, Colorado. We had a workshop there years ago. I think, you know, if we begin to think about the fact that, you know, these are ceremonies and rituals and so forth, which need to draw people in. I think we have to think very much in this regard. I mean, we need to have better translations of the liturgical prayers, I think. A little more poetic, a little less wooden. Our music has to be clear. I think the people that we see in the sanctuary, you know, in terms of gender, of culture, of background, of you know, disabilities, all these things, these should be factored in to say, this is the people of God at worship. So I think there's, just off the top of my head, these are some of the things that come. But I think, you as a liturgist, I'm sure think about these things, and this term attractiveness might be a way of, thinking about this in a particular and important way.
Wonderful. Well, Steve, the next one is kind of a follow-on, and now I'm not sure if it's a statement or a question. It comes from one of our board members. Would the church be more welcoming if the clergy spoke of Pope Francis's statements in the audience's local language rather than in Latin, such as Fratelli Tutti? Similar to the change from the Latin Mass being translated into local languages after Vatican II. That came from Tom Taylor, Steve.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Fratelli Tutti is Italian, and of course he's quoting he's quoting Francis of Assisi. But yes, I mean I definitely think that the language, as one of my friends said to me a long time ago, a Filipino friend, when you speak a local language, it touches the heartstrings of people. And maybe not only, the local language like English, but an English that people can understand. That is not, overly theoretical, but is eloquent in its own way, in its own appropriate way. So yes, I mean, I think the move for vernacular in the liturgy was such an important move. And I really treasure that. But I do think that the language should be really vernacular, not, varnished or something like that. So yes, I definitely agree that the more language you can do, the better it is.
Wonderful. This next question comes from Joan Christ. Do you think that this reform of the Curia will affect how the church deals with radical traditionalism and traditionalist orders of priests?
Well, I don't know, Joan. Good to hear from you, former student and a longtime friend. And I really do hope so. I really do. One thing it is supposed to do is to localize the church much more. So I think this might help. But at least theoretically, the emphasis on ministry and evangelization, it's not just orthodoxy. It's orthopraxy, as we say. It's the right feelings. It's the right the way of going about things. I think is what we need. So I really hope that it will. I mean, it's difficult. I don't think there's a silver bullet, so to speak. Maybe that's too violent an image, but there's no panacea to change things around. But I think one of the things with Francis is he's not afraid of conflict, and he's not afraid of the truth. And I think that's really one of the important things. So let's hope.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our friend and life trustee Barry Sullivan brings us the next question. Does the bishop's response to President Biden, compared with the Pope's, suggest two sides to the subsidiarity promised by the new document?
Well, spoken as a lawyer, Barry, it's always good to hear from you. I miss seeing you at St. Thomas, but I think it's maybe what I said before is that Francis is not afraid of conflict. He's not afraid of hearing the other side. In fact, one of his often quoted lines is that he was saying that some bishops don't want to confront him with things that they don't agree with, and he says, this is wrong. This is not synodality. This is not collegiality. So I think that, it's dangerous, of course. You could have a suppression. He could, fire all these people, in the Curia and Vigano and things like this. But he doesn't, because he says that even people who don't agree. It's in some ways it's like quoting Gaudium et Spes in Vatican II, where the document of the Church in the modern world that says we even learn from those people who are opposed to us. So in that sense, I think that might be, and already in some ways that's a strong reform of the Church, not comfortable, but it certainly is an openness that maybe we have not had in years before.
Wonderful.
Hope that answers the question, Barry.
I'm sure you'll hear from Barry if it didn't.
Okay.
Steve, this next question, it's from eGrop1. Thank you for your beautiful presentation. We have witnessed in the US the power of xenophobia, white supremacy, autocracy, etc., to attract people. How would Francis account for this? And how can the Church reach out to people attracted by these anti-gospel forms of relationship?
Oh boy, yeah, boy. That, especially the last question, I don't know. Although, what can I say? There was a quotation that I read from Francis's message to the bishops at the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, where he talked about kind of the vulnerability of God and the weakness of God and so forth. And I think that maybe what we need to do is to keep on being strong in telling the truth, but to also continue to be vulnerable. I think this is the Christian this is the Christian task. It's what is it? When you're called to be a disciple, you're called to suffer. And this is maybe one way the Church is suffering, and hopefully that might turn things around. But I think it's also, let's face it, evil is active in the world, but the way you overcome evil is not to suppress it, but like Jesus, to embrace it. To be vulnerable to it. That's hard stuff, but that's all I know.
Thank you, Steve. For our last question, comes from Al Mosul. Agreeably, evangelization is big for Pope Francis, mission is big. In the context of the pandemic, advancing a more digital expression of personal and ecclesial faith, can you share how Pope Francis deals with this intersection officially?
Well, I don't know. I don't follow Pope Francis on Twitter. I don't follow him on Facebook. I really don't know how he's doing. I do know that what was it, March 16th prayer service that he had during the height of the pandemic in Italy was so powerful, and those pictures of him there on that rainy evening, and and talking about do not be afraid in the storm, that Jesus is in the boat, and all that. I think that's really powerful. I think I haven't, I haven't quite parsed everything about, social media and internet and so forth in this time of pandemic. But I think, for instance, maybe I'm going off a little bit, but I really think that Sundays at CTU, we will never go back to just an in-person platform. I mean, there are over 300 people who tuned in to my presentation. We can't fit 300 people at CTU. So, I mean, I think this is something that's going to grow. It's going to be hybrid. I think, the way CTU is going to develop in terms of classes and so forth. I know Roger Schrader's telling me he was giving classes this past semester, and one person was in Ghana and one person was somewhere else in West Africa. And, he's never sure where people are who are taking his classes. And I think this is what's going to happen. And I think that, we're going to have, yes, I can't wait to get back to in-person stuff, but it's never going to be the same. And, if, there are very few silver linings in what we have experienced these last 9 months, but this may be one of them. I have a little thing I talk about collateral grace, that there are things, that have emerged out of this horrible situation.
Well, certainly we're grateful for the miracle of technology that we can continue these lectures and liturgy experiences. And Steve, thank you so very much for your time with us today, for illuminating the message of Pope Francis's Curial reform and his creation of a missionary church. For our new visitors here, I see so many familiar names and images out in the gallery, so it's wonderful.
Great.
But for those visiting us for the first time, a little word about CTU. We are a Roman Catholic graduate school of theology and ministry, founded just over 50 years ago in the spirit of Vatican II. We're governed by a union of 24 men's religious orders, the Divine Word Missionaries that Steve belongs to being one of them. And we're directed by a board of trustees who are comprised of both lay men and women and religious. We are one of the leading Catholic theological schools in the country and value diversity in our student body. Our students that Steve was referring to come from over 40 countries and consist of a mix of seminarians, women religious, lay men and women, and all of these students learning from and with each other side by side. So I invite you to sign up to receive information and engage further with CTU through our myriad events, courses, and resources at the link ctu.edu/free pass. So this concludes our program for today. But again, we invite you to continue the conversation. We have lectures and other events just like this, which can be found on our website, and a graphical link to our spring calendar is in the chat for you. This year, our annual Blessed Are the Peacemaker trustee dinner will be on April 28th, honoring Drs. Anthony Fauci and his wife, Dr. Christine Grady, for their extraordinary service as courageous healers and public servants. In addition, we invite you to follow us on our social media platforms. And you can sign up for weekly scripture reflections written by our renowned faculty like Steve, and other lectures on our media platform, learn.ctu.edu. So lastly, if you've enjoyed this afternoon's program and would like to support us in producing programs like this, we invite you to make a contribution to our mission at ctu.edu/give. We were delighted you could be with us today. Thank you all. Thank you, Steve, for your time with us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Can I say something
Oh,
before
yes,
we
please.
close?
Please.
I've been getting all sorts of chat messages and so forth from people who I so love and so care for, and other people who I don't know, but I'm just so grateful for that. And I can't respond once we get off the we get off the internet. I won't be able to respond to you all, but thank you for coming, and know that I so appreciate your